Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to On the Edge. Time now to go to Sydney and speak with, I'm sure you can guess who I'm going to speak with. There's only one famous economist in all of Australia, Steve Keen, author of Debunking Economics 1 and 2. Steve is a professor at the University of Western Sydney and blogger at debtdeflation.com. He's also an avid tweeter that you can find at his Twitter handle, Prof. Steve Keen. Steve, welcome back to On the Edge.
It's great to be here with you, Max.
All right, Steve Keen, Forbes magazine recently featured you as being the most accurate forecaster of the financial crisis. So what, oh great oracle, is your forecast for the remaining housing bubble nations such as Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Hong Kong?
Well, all bubbles eventually have to burst because they're all driven by accelerating debt. You get rising asset prices driven by accelerating debt. And as we all know, no car can accelerate forever. Therefore, equally, no debt bubble can keep on accelerating forever. Otherwise, we'd owe 1 billion times our income. So at some point, that acceleration has to peter out. And when it does, it becomes deceleration, and that drives the asset prices down. So inevitably, asset bubbles have to burst. And when they do, they take the real economy with them. So all those countries will ultimately end up with a similar fate to what America's been through, but delayed by slightly different timing in their debt dynamics.
All right, now let's talk about this overall crisis. It started in 2007. It gathered pace in 2008. And there's been two basic responses. There's been the response that we've seen in the UK of austerity. We've also seen this response in the Eurozone. And then there's the idea of spending or deficit spending or Keynesian spending that we've seen in the United States. Both approaches have failed. Why is that, and what should be the right approach?
In general, Max, austerity is, in a downturn, is always the wrong policy, because what you have is an economy where the private sector has stopped spending, and you therefore have a deficiency of demand. And if you have the government doing the same thing at the same time, you'll basically add to that downturn. Now, people often think that the government, always gets things wrong, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, but it's a bit like saying, let's imagine you've got a room which is being freezing because the temperature is not high enough outside. You whack an air conditioning on, like what's called a homeostatic stabilizer. So that's the role of government spending in that situation. The economy turns down. If the government necessarily collects less tax revenue, spends more on welfare, it runs a deficit, and it provides firms with a cash flow they wouldn't otherwise have to get them out of a downturn or to stop them going completely bankrupt during the downturn. So that's a normal response of the government spending, which is the next level, the usual Keynesian sort of thing. That has barely worked this time round. I wouldn't like to imagine where America would be if there hadn't been that automatic stabilizer effect, plus also the large stimulus programs. But it certainly hasn't been enough to turn this back from a massive downturn back to a usual recovery cycle. The reason it hasn't worked is because this is driven not just by the usual slowdown in the rate of growth of debt and slowdown in economic growth at the same time. This is massive deleveraging. The private sector has borrowed its way into enormous levels of debt over about a 40 or 50 year period, going from owing about half a year's GDP as the debt level back in the 1950s to 3 years GDP now. And now it's delevered to 2.5 years worth of debt, and it's simply on the long downward trajectory of reducing its overall level of debt by every year spending less than it earns, using the difference to pay debt down, and therefore having less aggregate demand than we have aggregate supply. That's depressing markets indefinitely. So until that process is over, no stimulus program alone is going to work. The only way to make this crisis go away more rapidly is to reduce the level of debt directly.
Steve Keen, your work, of course, draws on some of the work of Hyman Minsky. And so my question is, can you describe the stages that Minsky describes in his work that lead us up to this Minsky moment, as it's called? It goes through a few stages. Number two, how does your work kind of differentiate itself from Minsky's work?
Starting from vision, the essential element of Minsky's vision that differentiates him from the neoclassical paradigm, of there's many, but one of the most important ones is he sees the economy as inherently cyclical. So you start from that perspective, it's got cycles, get used to it. But on top of saying it's cyclical, you said it's also fundamentally financial. That again makes him different to the conventional economists. And because it's financial and because it's cyclical, there'll be a period of some point in the historic past where there would have been some crisis, a debt-driven crisis, 1990 being an obvious example in America. And in the aftermath of that crisis, everybody is conservative about the amount of debt they'll take on. So that means that only conservatively worked out projects get debt financed. And because the economy has recovered from the crisis, most of those projects succeed. And because they succeed, people think, oh, if we actually were more highly levered, we would have made more money. So their expectations improve, and they go in a transition from what Minsky calls subdued expectations to euphoric expectations. So he fundamentally argues that capitalism is inherently unstable, and a period of tranquil growth leads to rising expectations, which destabilizes the system even further. So in that euphoric state, and you've seen plenty of cases of capitalists in euphoric states, and certainly finance capitalists very much that way, they'll borrow money, they'll gamble on asset prices, they'll cause a bubble out of that. But of course, a lot of this borrowing is badly thought out. Projects don't work. They're Ponzi schemes in many ways to begin with. You'll then have an overhang of debt. The boom will turn into a bust. And then you go through another cycle of the same nature. And over that period, you go through a period of steps where from one cycle to another, the debt level ratchets up and doesn't quite ratchet back down again. So you go through a period of ratcheting up levels of debt until you get to a point where there's so much debt taken on that the system simply can't cope with it, and you go into a terminal downturn. And that's where we are right now. So that was Minsky's overall vision. And it made sense to me because it was criticizing capitalism not for being depressive, which is why a lot of left-wing critics attack capitalism, but by saying it's got a fundamentally upward instability, which is debt finance, which will lead to euphoric behavior and a boom leading to a crash. What I added to Minsky was Minsky never made a sensible mathematical model of that. And that's partly because his time in the economic sun predated the development of chaos theory and complexity analysis. Since I was raised at that time, I immediately saw a chaotic model behind what Minsky was talking about, and I used the modern mathematical techniques to build a model which fundamentally had this tendency towards chaos in it. And simply by adding the fact that people borrow money to finance investment, that gave me the essential element that I could build on a model of a cyclical economy done by Richard Goodwin, which itself was based on insights from Marx back in 1867. Putting those all together, I got a model that gave me chaotic behavior with a period of instability leading to apparent stability, which economists call the Great Moderation, and then followed by rising instability once more, leading to the sort of breakdown we're going through now. So when I finished my first paper on that, which is a mathematical paper, I finished it with what I thought was a rhetorical flourish back in 1993, published in 95, and I said, the chaotic dynamics of thought in this paper should warn us against regarding any period of relative tranquility in a capitalist economy as anything other than a lull before the storm.
Okay, so to summarize here a little bit and to lead into my next question, the investors are investing in projects. They offer a rate of return. As those rates of return come in, expectation for future rates of return increase, and so does the leverage, leading to this inflation of the leverage, which is at some point unsustainable, and you have the crash. Now, this just seems to me like a pretty sane analysis of human nature and of the business cycle. But when you talk to or hear central bankers, they are often talk about wanting to eliminate the cycle by adjusting monetary policy. And yet, all of these decades of monetary policy adjustments have not at all changed the cycle. In fact, it's added more instability and bigger and greater crashes. Would it be fair to say that the whole presence of the central banks to begin with just adds another layer of, let's call it moral hazard, where there's a false assumption of risk mitigation where that is simply impossible?
Absolutely. I mean, I really think history will look back and say that Alan Greenspan turned what would have been a garden variety small depression back in 1987 into the biggest depression in human history by rescuing the financial sector from each of its mistakes, which simply meant that it would then go looking for some other social class to lend money to, expanding the level of debt. We went from the situation in the late 1980s, when the level of debt compared to GDP was roughly the same as at the time of the start of the Great Depression back in the 1920s, to where debt was 1.7 times as high. And that's not even including any of the CDOs or CDSs or all the other obscure financial instruments that were also created on Greenspan's watch. So if the central banks hadn't been trying to rescue us from each of the individual small financial crises, we would have had a minor depression, whereas given what's happened, we're now in for the biggest of all time, and quite an intractable problem. So yes, without doubt, by trying to manipulate the system and make it more stable, controlling that instability, in fact, they damped it for a period of time, but let the actual causal factor, the level of debt compared to income, rise to unprecedented levels. And now we're dealing with the biggest financial crisis ever, and we can certainly blame the central banks for the scale of it.
Okay, let's talk about complexity theory and chaos theory for a second. My remembrance of studying physics may be a bit rusty, but I seem to recall that as you add more complexity, or in this case, more debt, there's an exponential rise, and not a linear rise, but an exponential rise in the probability of a collapse. One unit additional debt equals many times that unit of potential catastrophe. Isn't that true in a complex theory like we have with the global economy and the debt Ponzi scheme that is running it?
Yeah, I mean, when I did the model, Max, when I first worked on it, I started off on a model from Richard Goodwin. It just simply had two components to it. Once you work the whole mathematics through, you got two fundamental components. One was the income distribution, which was shared between workers and capitalists. They were the only two classes in the model. And the other was the employment rate. And when I added in the fact that capitalists borrow money to finance investment, so you got a banking sector inside there, I had a third element, which is the ratio of debt to GDP. And what I found out of that model and analyzing it mathematically was that when you found its equilibrium, and a chaotic system does not necessarily tend towards its equilibrium. When you work that equilibrium out, it turned out that there was an equilibrium profit share of output, there was an equilibrium debt level, and there was an equilibrium level of employment. What dropped out as a residual was the workers' share of output. And the workers' share of output was negatively related to the level of debt. So as the level of debt rose, wasn't the capitalist who paid for it, even though they were ones doing the borrowing, it was workers in share in terms of their income share. So when the system was unstable, you'd have a rising level of debt, a falling workers' share of income, no particular impact on the rate of profit. That was very volatile until a final crash occurred when the debt level became exponential. So the rising debt ended up being paid for by the working class, the ones who are now paying for it through austerity, at the moment, actually are the ones who paid for it by having a lower share of income, not the capitalists, as we know from the last 20 or 30 years. And certainly that exponential rising level of debt was a fundamental part of the breakdown. If the debt hasn't risen exponentially, you and I wouldn't be talking about this. We'd be talking about some wonderful technological innovation. So the rising level of debt played an essential role in causing this crisis.
Okay, so now the way we see this in the simple metric that can be easily quoted is the percentage that the banking industry has of GDP in these G20 countries in the US or the UK. So going back 20 years, that percentage of the economy maybe was 3 or 4%. Now in the case of the UK, which you have rightly pointed out has the worst situation in the world right now of debt to GDP, the financial sector accounts for something like 30% of the GDP by one measure. If you include all the tertiary and ancillary businesses that are involved, it's actually a much higher number. But that's where it shows up in the daily newspaper, right? When they say the financial sector is now 30 or 40%. So when David Cameron says that he needs to protect the banking interests in the UK from further regulation, he's effectively arguing in favor of cancer, financial cancer, isn't he?
Absolutely. I mean, the financial sector should be a necessary service sector towards industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalists need to be able to borrow money because that's the fundamental source of the capacity to expand production, produce new technologies and so on. That's the sensible service role that finance capital has. But finance capital doesn't make money. Finance capital is a charge on the actual profit being made in the industrial capitalist sector. So if you have a very large financial sector, what you've actually got is a very large charge on the productive sector of the economy. And a large financial sector is a sign of a sick economy, not a healthy one.
Right, and so you're not against saying that debt per se is it should be outlawed, but that as a utility, like electricity is a utility or water is a utility, bank credit should be a utility, should be regulated as a utility, and in so doing, you would have a much more vibrant economy, a diversified economy, instead of a predatory monoculture of banks that are gaming the system and causing the instability to increase and the crashes to increase. Let's talk about the Australian banking system for a second. It looks like the Australian housing market is now in the crash of the real estate sector, as you've been predicting now for a few years. This undoubtedly will affect the Australian banks. What names? Let's talk names. Which banks in Australia are going to suffer most in this now?
So there's only four major banks inside the country: the Commonwealth Bank, Westpac, NAB, and ANZ. Of the four, I really don't study the banks in that intricate detail, Max. I look at the macro level, but I'd say the ones that I'd regard as probably most wonky are the ones that expanded most during the bubble. It looks like ANZ did a lot of irresponsible lending. NAB was a bit slow off the mark. It's not quite so badly caught off. I'd be looking at ANZ and Westpac as potentially the ones that have got the most damaged portfolios. You've also got the Bank of Queensland, which appears as one of the minor lenders to have got itself extended into a whole lot of lending to very speculative capitalists and developers. So, but in general, the overall situation, was what I really do know something about, is that if you look at the level of exposure to mortgage debt of the banking sector in Australia, how much of their assets are made up by mortgages as opposed to other forms of loans, it's actually a higher ratio than applied at the peak of the American bubble. So the Australian banks are more exposed to a downturn in the real estate market than the American banks were, and we know what happened to them. So what I expect to see now that the housing market is falling is that those portfolios are going to start looking very, very shaky. Because, of course, with falling house prices, you also have rising unemployment, because they're both driven by the same factor, the acceleration of debt.
Okay, so 6 months from now or a year from now, the Australian economy will be well underway with a crash. The Australian banks will be insolvent. And so the Australian government will have two choices. Either they go the Anglo-Saxon way of mollycoddling the banking terrorists, as I call them, and giving them money and opening up the coffers and simply splashing money on them because they worship whatever it is they're doing, market fundamentalism, I guess you could call it. Or the Swedish response, which is to let the suckers, have to pay for their mistakes and let it recycle after a crash. Given your take, you're in Australia, which way do you think the Australian government's going to lean? Mollycoddling or tough love?
Absolutely mollycoddling, mate. They'll go totally down the same old track of rescuing the parasites and making the host pay for the rescue. We're totally beholden to the banks over here. Despite my best efforts, there's been no real change in the political power structure over the obsequiousness of the politicians to the banking sector. Will go through exactly the same painful learning process as the rest of the world.
And how about the property developers? Will they be given a wet kiss like the property developers in Ireland were, or will they be facing justice for their crimes at all?
Another wet kiss, I think, and certainly given the power of some of the developers around here and the way they've got the state governments in their pocket, they'll be giving wet kisses galore. You would hope that people would learn from the mistakes, but what people learn prior to a mistake is we're different to everywhere else, it won't happen to us. Yeah, and then it goes and it happens again, and it's the same painful process. We're not quite as bad as Iceland or as Ireland ended up being, but I think we're going to go through the same process of rescuing the parasites rather than rescuing the host.
Okay, now the last time we spoke, Steve Keen, we were a bit shocked because at that time it was revealed that the UK debt bubble is a lot worse than many had talked about. Morgan Stanley found that the debt to GDP there was close to 1,000%, including the bank debt. Now, you've taken a look at this some more. What's the current read on the UK and the debt phenomenon?
Well, I've actually written a blog post on that particular topic. I can't remember his name right now, Max, but if people go to my site, they can search and see a comparison of Australia to America to England. I'll be putting up another more detailed one shortly. What I found was that I work from saying that aggregate demand in a capitalist economy is not just income, it's income plus the change in debt. And therefore, the rate of change of debt becomes a fundamental driver of instability in cycles when you get to the stage when the debt is as gigantic as it was in Australia's case America's and certainly the UK's. So various times between 2005 and 2010, the increase in debt was equivalent to 60% of GDP in the English case. That's far bigger than anything had happened in the American. So an absolute boom at that stage and booming house prices. Then it would fall down again. But unlike the American, which continued going down until the stage where you had the fall in debt subtracting about 25% of GDP from demand, England would bounce down and bounce up. Now it seems to be trending down. And so given the fact that you're finally seeing deleveraging occurring in England, that again would lead to falling asset prices. And I think that becomes a positive feedback process, which I think will probably drive England into the most severe of the downturns this year. I think will be probably Europe first, given the madness of their austerity programs. But second and possibly first place will go to the UK as it finally falls into deleveraging, probably on the same scale as America had. And given the fact that you've got, it's fraud central, we all know that the biggest frauds occurred in the English financial sector. I've got a feeling that the money will be pulled out there extremely rapidly by fraudsters. They're the last ones who want to lose their money, legitimately or otherwise. And you'll see a probably serious credit crunch in England when that happens.
Okay, Steve Keen, we've got about 30 seconds left. Your thoughts on Greece? Will a new layer of debt from the ECB keep the ball rolling, or is it another Lehman situation and trigger a global bank crisis?
Well, I think a bank crisis is far more likely. But when are the generals going to step in here? We know that Greece has been a dictatorship in the past, and it's a nationalistic dictatorship when it happens. At some stage, I think we're going to see a coup over there because they've got a neoclassical economist running the country, of course, doing exactly what the banks tell him to do because he believes it's actually better for the Greeks. I think at some stage the Greeks are going to have him on pitchforks and the generals will be back in there again and they'll just basically say we're not paying back this debt. There's no way that any society can sustain the level of deprivation that's been forced on Greece by the European Union and enforced by one of their own who's a neoclassical economist. So I think Greece will probably be the first place with a political revolt coming out of this whole crisis.
All right, Dr. Steve Keen, thanks so much for being on The Edge. We're out of time.
Great to be with you, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Keiser. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Steve Keen. You can find his work at debtdeflation.com or on Twitter. His handle there is Prof. Steve Keen. This is Max Keiser. If you want to send me an email, send it to ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.